episode, I will be looking at a photograph by Mallory Neal, and it is of downtown Pittsburgh looking through a fence, it looks like. So first, I'll take it into the Develop tab, and what I normally do is I will look at the histogram and notice anything that I won't be able to edit. So first, we're looking at the shadows and how they're properly exposed. You have some blacks that are a little darker, and then your highlights are nicely exposed as well. You have all the detail that you need to edit this photograph. So then after that, I will take it down to transform, and I always click auto to see how that goes, and then to check the distortion of the camera to make sure that all the buildings are in line specifically with landscape photography or cityscape photography. And then using the arrow keys, you can go by 5% increments. So that one wasn't good, so we'll take it back a little. Yeah, it needs a little bit more adjusting. Yeah, like -2 should be good. Yep. And then we'll do some lens correction. I always do chromatic aberration, and chromatic aberration is the red lines that were showing up around the buildings, like right here, or right here. So click that and that disappears. Then we'll look at the composition. So with the crop tool, we can figure out a little bit more on how the buildings are located within the frame. So it needs a little bit more tilted, and then I'm a big proponent of having clean corners. So these corners are clean from the looks of it. So this one though is a little distracting, so I'd probably crop that in, especially since you're not losing too much over on this side, and then you're not losing any of the railroad tracks, river, or PPG. Then that's whenever I get into the editing process. But first, let's critique this composition. So you have nice balance between PPG over here and one Oxford Center over here. And then you have UPMC and BNY right in the middle. Filler buildings create nice dimension that leads you through, and then these nice lines down here that create sort of a depth or foreground. The only thing that I would say about this composition would be moving a little bit down the river walk to the right to get more of PPG in frame, as the Key Bank building takes a little bit away from it. And that's about it. Yeah, there's just overall good balance. Now, I'm not a big fan of fence photos, but obviously this isn't my photograph, so I can't really complain there. But otherwise, look at it as another piece of work that needs to be appreciated. Just noticing that that's a little not cropped out enough. Another thing would be that this line right here is covering some of PPG, but it's not distracting as these are out of focus, shot at a lower aperture, which is f4.5. Let's see the other metadata of this frame. You can hit I to see the pixels or the time and date. Okay, so it was shot with a 18-135, 3.5 to 5.6 variable aperture lens. So I think that all checks out and is a nice exposure. So then so let's move into the edit. So for this photograph, it is a little, looking at the histogram, it is a little darker. We do have some room to play in the highlights. So I'm gonna bring it up a little and just sort of try to get this white to match very well. Try to get the sky to be a little bit more white or gray. I mean, this photograph is taken in January, so Pittsburgh definitely has some gray to it. We're going to take the highlights down just to add a little bit more detail, and then pull up the shadows normally, but depending on photograph that could change. Checking out the details within the photograph and the settings. We don't need to do too much with noise, but every once in a while I will come to the detail tab and just bring up the color reduction. That doesn't add any sort of blurriness or anything like that, but it does add a little bit more subtle grain, or take away more of the grain. Then before I get into the basic tab, I normally come down to the curves, and I normally do like a S curve or a contrast curve, and just sort of like see how that works. You can also hold Alt or Option to get this, like not move it as far and keep it on like a similar plane. So like right there is probably about good. For this, depending on the mood, you may want to play with the temperature or the tint. So this photograph is from January, so it's a little colder. So just to match these whites a little bit more, you can also use the eyedropper tool to click there and it'll give you pretty basic correction. So that's a little too cold for my eye, so I'm just going to take it back up a little to get the gray back into the clouds, because we don't want to lose the gray, as the gray adds a little bit more of a density to the photograph rather than just the white sky, which takes away from it. And then as you see, I edit with a white background in Lightroom, so that helps be able to tell how much detail I will be losing. Then we'll come back over to the basic tab. I don't really play with the whites. You can, but they don't really do too much besides just sort of like overexpose or ruin the photograph in my opinion. UPMC has a blue glow, so that means that this is pushing a little bit, but it's not bad. Ever since they threw the dehaze tool in there, I've been using dehaze more. So this gives it, like, you can see how this works. And it's sort of beneficial for this photograph, but not too much, so I'd probably keep it less than 10. I always pump a little bit of clarity in just to sharpen it up a little and get rid of like anything that the lens might have missed. This photograph is a little bit out of focus as it was taken with it at f4.5 and then a shutter speed at 1/50th, so this is probably handheld, but it's not as distracting as you would think, as these foreground buildings are a little bit more sharp. We'll come down here, and I don't do too much more besides the tone curve and lens correction or that, but I do come down into calibration, and you can set different primaries or shadows. So like this will put green or purple in your shadow or magenta in your shadows. So this one's pretty good. I just brought the green down a little bit just to fill it in a little better with the the colors. Then I always push my saturation up on each of these hues by 5, but I don't really mess with the hue unless I need to and if it's off, but this photograph looks to be pretty well maintained with color. Then with this photograph in particular, I will probably take the graduated filter up in the top right and try to do something with this bottom section right here, maybe brightening it up a little just to add some more reason to look at that portion of the photograph, bring the shadows, bring the blacks down, just add that contrast more, and then pumping the dehaze a little bit more. We could even go a little bit more into it by pulling one directly over the railroad tracks and just doing a little bit more to boost the notoriety of that portion of the photograph, as it is your foreground. And then looking back at the city, it's not as just focused on the city. Then to combat that and make it a little bit more cohesive, I'll definitely bring this down and cover up the whole city and pump the exposure a little bit more, get the whites close enough to almost that they're fully white, and then of course pump some more saturation in, bring the shadows and the blacks down to really bring out more detail and more color to the image. And if you've noticed, I don't really use saturation or vibrance, as they're more artificial than anything, in my opinion, but that's what you want to do. If that's your plan, then go for it. Then we can come over here and sort of look out these buildings. There's just like lights, none of this really distracting. These trees down here, though they may be a little out of focus due to wind or the 1/50th shutter speed, but it's not really distracting. So for this image, I'd say that you could easily bump the shutter speed up to, let's see what lens. So you're shooting at 35mm, so you want to have at least double. So you should be at 70mm or 1/70th at least, which you can't do. So I'd go to 1/100th and then bring the ISO up a little. And that'll just make the image sharper, and then you won't have like a little fogginess to it, like especially on the PPG building, you can see it more up here with the spires. And then like I was saying, down here with these branches. I mean, we could play a little bit more with the cropping. If I wanted to adjust this more, I'd say we could probably get rid of this binding right here so that you can sort of have this line just lead out of the frame like these ones do, and then sort of just have it framed more. So then, but I'm realizing I cut off PPG, so we'll just bring it up a little and get that spire in. And you want to have enough space that you're not necessarily touching the top. And I'm not too afraid of losing a little bit more of the railroad down here, as there's just enough, and it's just like another side frame to this the river and then the wharf parking lot below the city that holds it all together. Now, the crop, what I did notice that I enjoyed more was that it did balance out this a little bit more, that it had this on the one side and then these buildings on the other side. That really created more balance, and these ones being framed right in the center as well, creating like a sort of like tooth structure to it with these buildings creating stairs almost. And local adjustments, if you wanted to, we could go into the radial filter. We could use it on, actually I don't think you could really use it for this photograph, as it would be sort of distracting and not really match the buildings too well. But if you wanted to look more at this filter that we used for the city, this one you can drag and position it. But if you come over here to the range mask and you click luminance, you can choose how this mask affects without the other parts of the photograph. So you can see how the top is losing the contrast and the adjustments that I made up here, and then if you pull down here, it'll be doing the same thing to the bottom. So because I don't want it to really affect the bottom of the frame, I'm just going to pull it up and make sure that it's not really doing that, and then these local adjustments on the bottom will be doing most of the work rather than the one that I threw on top. Now, I normally take my photographs into Photoshop to edit them a little further, so you just do that by clicking Command or Control E in Lightroom. When I bring it into Photoshop, the first thing I'll do is I'll come down to my channels panel and I'll Command to click the RGB, and then I'll select all these areas that just have color in them, and then I'll do a curves adjustment layer. So then that'll bring up the curves box, and just same thing, just add in contrast. Normally bringing down the highlights and bringing down the shadows a little bit more, just to add that contrast and bring it down, sort of like a luminosity mask to an extent. And then, so this photograph has some reds, blues, greens, but this is mainly a blue photograph. So I'll just do a command click on the blue channel and curves again, and then I'll just bring it down a little more, add some contrast. You can see what these two do right there. This is a little too strong for me, so I'll actually bring it back up a little, and then same as this one, yep, like right around there. And then I'll click curves, and then this is how I do like most of my like quick dodge and burning. I'm gonna go up to here, image, apply image, and then this dialog will pop up, and you'll then click OK. This is merge RGB and multiply opacity 100, and this will just grab all the highlights to begin with, and we can just bring them down and get a little bit more detail within here and really add some more contrast to it, but it also adds detail. So we'll do that again, apply image, but this time we'll click invert, and this will grab the shadows. So we'll bring the shadows up a little bit more, and then bring the highlights down just a little bit, so that brings out the shadows, and then it brings down the highlights so that there's nothing really missing. You can see these masks with an Alt or Option click, and you can see how they're affecting the photograph. And then that's really it. And then make sure that you Command save, and there's your photograph. And then it should load back into Lightroom as a second copy. Here's the whole before, and then here's the after. And then here is Mallory's edit of the photograph. Make sure you guys check out Mallory's work at NKoehlerPhotography on Instagram. I hope you guys enjoyed watching this video and you come to check out the next critique.